In the next section of the discussion, Aristotle seeks to clarify further the nature of virtue and give some practical advice on how it is achieved. Don't forget, this is in effect a lecture that he's giving to a group of students. They want to walk out of the discussion with a very solid way of making decisions, so they know what to do. So, recall. The good life for a human, i.e. a life that will produce happiness and will be lived well, is a life where the rational activity of the soul, or choice, is practiced in a manner that exhibits excellence, which is virtuous, or leading to the virtue, which is the excellent choice, the perfect choice, the right choice. To put this another way, a virtuous life is one of actively practicing rational choice. Or again, a good life is one in which one uses the faculty of rationality to choose and actively engage in a particular choice. The degree of excellence, the degree of precision or rightness in this choice is a measure of how virtuous the choice and act is. All this raises some very tricky questions. Can there be degrees of virtue? Can there be more or less virtuous? Is it the act that is virtuous, or is it the person? Can a bad person perform a virtuous act? So is it the act that is virtuous, or is it the person? Book 2 starts off and he says, let's distinguish. We've got intellectual and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues are taught and can be gained by learning. Moral virtues are gained by practice, by habit. To return to our earlier question, the case of intellectual virtues, in the case of intellectual virtues, it is the case that it is the concept that will be judged virtuous. So you can be taught, for example, that courage is a virtue. The virtue is the intellectual concept of courage. You, by knowing that, doesn't make you virtuous, doesn't make you courageous. It just means that you have the intellectual knowledge of that virtue. In the case of moral virtue, it would be the person practicing the virtuous act based on the knowledge of the virtue, who might be judged as being virtuous to the degree to which they achieve excellence in their choice. This does not fully answer the question, can a bad person perform a virtuous act? And does this therefore make them a virtuous person? There was recently a TV show which we've mentioned a few times called The Good Place. It's actually based on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, quite clearly, and it includes a lot of other ethical scenarios, such as there's several thought experiments that it engages in. There's a thought experiment about if you were on a railway cart, and you have a choice, a split. You go down this way and you kill one person who you know, or you go down this way and you kill several people that you don't know, and you have to make choice. So those sorts of things this TV show has enjoyed playing with, and it's done it very effectively. So Aristotle's answer, I think, to the question, can a bad person perform a virtuous act, can be explained by looking at this show. The person first intellectually learns what is virtuous by being taught. So for any of you who don't know the show, it is the story of a woman who is regarded as a bad person because of the acts that she commits on earth. She dies, and without too many spoilers, she goes to the good place, which is equivalent to a sort of an idea of heaven. But she's been sent there by accident. She doesn't want anyone to find out that she's a bad person, in which case she would go to the bad place, i.e. hell. So the way to get around this is she decides she better act in a good way, even though, as she knows about herself, she's not a good person, she's a bad person. Even her motivation for acting in a good way is not for doing good for other people or doing good for the sake of good. Her motivation is doing good to keep her out of hell. It's purely selfish. She finds a teacher who actually starts teaching her Aristotle, and he starts to teach her how to make good decisions. So he teaches her the virtues. She learns the virtues intellectually. She then starts to practice them. When she practices them, to begin with, she's doing it purely for selfish motivation. We wouldn't really talk about her as being a virtuous person just because she is committing virtuous acts. But throughout the show, what happens is she becomes, through the habit of performing these virtuous acts, the show suggests that she becomes a virtuous person. So the continuous and regular practice of this virtue leads to habitualization, i.e. this choice becomes so ingrained in the person that it becomes their nature, an instinctive manner of acting, without reference to the intellectual teaching. Thus, according to Aristotle, a bad person may perform a virtuous act without thereby being virtuous. However, the habitual practice of this act will actually transform them into a virtuous person. Aristotle sets this up because what he's saying in a very practical way to his students is learn what the virtues are intellectually and then practice them again and again. And it doesn't matter. You can imagine him saying, it doesn't matter whether or not you believe in it, whether or not you accept it. Just practice it. Practice it habitually until it becomes, or until you become what it is. Until you become virtuous. There's some tricky question that arises out of that. I'll leave this little section here for you to read yourself and think about. It's not something that is explicit in the text, not a question that Aristotle considers. It is not something that I've seen turn up in an exam. However, what you want to be developing in yourself is the ability to ask critical questions, to push your understanding. It probably won't arise in a short answer question in the exam, but if you have an essay question and you are given the opportunity to explore an idea in a bit more depth and you push an idea beyond just what you're hearing in class, the chances are that no one else or very few other people will have expressed this idea in their exams, which means your essay will stand out. There'll be something about it. Most of the essays that the examiners will mark are going to basically have the same information. Some will have something unique, just that little bit extra. They will go beyond the text. They will go beyond the text maybe to look at some other texts and compare. Or they will go beyond the text or deeper into the text by asking questions that aren't in, say, the VCE textbook. That's actually what your examiners really value. It stands out. It makes you stand out. Aristotle has recognized that what makes a good life, the activity of the rational soul in accordance with excellence, and he's recognized that virtue is first learnt and then developed by habit, to the point where we can talk about a moral virtue. He's said all of this to his audience, but you can imagine them saying, great, so we can learn what a virtue is, but how do we make the right choice? We can learn without really understanding. We can be told generosity is a virtue, patience is a virtue. I'm going to encounter a choice. I know I need to be patient or generous or courageous. How do I find that? There might be a choice. For example, one of his students could have said to him, I might be struck with the choice in battle. Yeah, we're about to go into battle. I know courage I've been intellectually taught that courage is a virtue. But what is courage? How do I identify what is courageous? 1,000 enemy are approaching and there's only me. Is it courageous for me to run into them? Or is that just stupid? Is that rash? What happens if I run away? Is that cowardness? How do I identify the virtue? So this leads Aristotle to offer his students a sort of a scheme, which is known as the doctrine of the mean. Now, note quickly, the doctrine of the mean is often referred to, if you look it up on Google, it's often referred to as the golden mean. I find this slightly confusing in so much as in ancient Greek philosophy there's also the idea of the golden ratio. The golden ratio being a mathematical proportion upon which all things are based. I have no doubt that in Aristotle's mind, he doesn't refer to it as the golden mean in our text, that in Aristotle's mind, he would be able to see that ethics is a reflection, that all things are a reflection of the principle. If the golden mean is the principle, then ethical choice would be at a certain level a reflection of this. To keep it clear in our mind, I would advise you to refer to the mean rather than the golden mean. The other clarification I want to make in terms of this word means was earlier you heard me talk about a means to an end. Be really careful. I'm using the word distinctly. A means is a way to an end. The mean, any of you doing mathematics will think of it as the average, but probably better than the average. Think of it as the middle point, the intermediary point. So put simply, Aristotle says that virtue is a mean between the vices of excess and defect. And again, I've made a little note about the word defect there, which you can read. Again, getting you to think about this deeper. A lot of texts you'll read will talk about the mean as the balance between excess and deficiency. The term balance is again problematic. Balance implies where two things are held in equilibrium. So you could have 10 measures of excess. As long as you had 10 measures of deficiency, then it is in balance. But Aristotle doesn't intend us to understand the mean in this way. The mean isn't having a balance of excess and deficiency. The mean is having no excess, no deficiency. It is the point at the very center from which excess is measured and from which deficiency is measured. Aristotle himself refers to the middle or the intermediate. In this sense, it is neither excessive nor deficient to any degree. Moreover, virtue is not the opposite of the vices. That's another mistake that sometimes gets made. People talk about, say, courage as being the opposite of cowardness. So this is a little bit tricky. The way Aristotle explains it, he says the two vices, in the case that we have here, being recklessness and cowardness, the two vices, recklessness and cowardness, recklessness is the opposite of cowardness. Cowardness is the opposite of recklessness. But taken together, the two vices are the opposite of the virtue. But there are always two vices to each single virtue. So rather, the two vices is considered the opposites of each other and the virtue. So I suppose in that sense you can talk about cowardness as an opposite of courage, but just be careful that you understand how it is an opposite of courage. It is not, cowardness is not the opposite of courage in the same way that cowardness is the opposite of recklessness. Cowardness and recklessness are opposites. Both of them are opposite to courage. And I just put a sign up to say that that little image which I'd found online is, in my opinion, incorrect with a deeper understanding of the term balance. So here's some examples of the mean: cowardness, courage, rashness. It's worthwhile having several in your mind as concrete examples that you can turn to. Even better are the ones that Aristotle mentions in his text. So it's Book 2, 7. They actually form the basis of an exam question once. So go through, list them, try and learn them. There's an element with much of what we do where you just need to know the material. You just need to go over it. Flashcards are great at just learning these quotes. Go back through this, pick out the key quotes, learn those key quotes, pick out examples of the mean, learn them, so that you can then use them when you're writing about all this. Then we get to some problems that arise with the doctrine of the mean, and actually Aristotle recognizes these problems himself. All right, he is a pragmatic and quite I don't want to say humble. He is aware of the limitations of his study. Goes right back to the start of what we were looking at, where he said we're going to look at this through the science of politics. Politics is imprecise. He is aware of the imprecision. Instead of trying to hide from the imprecision, like someone who was maybe going, oh, this is my theory is the best, I don't want you to question it. Aristotle's not like that. He goes, this is my theory, let's look at where its failings are so that we can use it, but always being aware of its limitations. So essentially, what's strong about the mean is it gives us a very simple, strong point to aim at. It gives us the virtue to aim at. But how are we to know when this point is achieved, given that the minutest deviancy results in a vice, either defect or excess? Moreover, won't these means be relative to different individuals? Won't they be subjective? The key one we've kept talking about here was cowardice, courage, cowardice, and rashness. In a battle situation, obviously, a huge, Thor, what is courageous for Thor will be different to what is courageous for me, because I don't have the sort of strength or the ability to fight as Thor. It was mentioned that recently there was a TV show, I think it's called Survivor, and one of the trials the contestants had to do was to jump into the sea. For all the people engaging in this, it was a measure of were they willing to jump from a height, so they had to be relatively courageous. One of the contestants had survived a tsunami where I think it was her had nearly been killed in the sea. So for her, the idea of jumping back into the sea, the open water of the sea, was terrifying. So for her, the exact same act, we would probably say she needed to be more courageous than anyone else. But it's still the same act. And what that shows us is that courage, or the virtue, was relative to the individual. Again, that makes it hard to say that is courageous, so we can identify that is what we should do. If you were looking upon this and you were trying to say, well, what is courage? How do I know what is courage? How do I know how I should make my choice? And you said, well, I'll watch that person and then I'll watch this person. Courage changes from person to person, so it becomes harder to identify. What else does he recognize? Another problem arises when we consider certain vices don't seem to fit into this scheme. And this is something Aristotle recognizes. Not every action or every passion admits of a mean. The classic ones here are murder and adultery. what is the virtue for these vices? We would all generally say that murder is a vice. If murder is a vice, in what way is it an excess or is it a defect of something? What is the virtue that it is an excess or a defect of? And it's not. So Aristotle recognizes there's a problem here with the doctrine of the mean. He doesn't necessarily give us an answer. He just sort of says it's almost like we need to learn these types of vices and just know them. So instead of using the scale of the mean to make our decision, we just know that they're wrong or right. It was suggested, and I'll give credit to one of my students today, who did engage in precisely the kind of more in-depth thinking that we are looking for. So Tess, what she suggested was maybe the problem here is that murder isn't actually a vice. We just assume murder is a vice or adultery is a vice. Murder is an act. And so her argument, which is a really clever one, if I jump back to these examples and we look down to the bottom, self-control, impulsiveness, indecisiveness, murder might be said to be an act that arises out of impulsiveness or possibly even greed or any other number of excesses. The murder isn't the vice. The murder is an act that arises out of the vice. And the mean would have been, in this case, self-control. That's a really clever way to address this problem with the doctrine of the mean. The other question or point that one of the students raised today was, how are we to, we've been told that there are certain virtues, i.e. we are taught these are intellectual virtues. The question arises, who says that courage is a virtue? Where does this idea come from? This is what's called absolutism. There is an idea that certain virtues and vices are absolute. They're almost, in a sense, set in stone, delivered by God, and that raises certain problems. What I would recommend you do there is research absolutism or natural law even. One of the other suggestions that arose in the conversations we've had about this is that maybe these virtues and therefore the vices are identified and then taught as intellectual knowledge, intellectual virtues, are identified according to, for example, how good they are for society or for the individual. So rashness is dangerous. It will lead to damage to the individual and to the society. Cowardness is damaging. It will lead to damage to the individual and society. Courage, the intermediate, the mean, is the point of either no damage or least damage. And maybe that's how we come up with these first principles. Aristotle next questions the nature of moral virtue. He suggests there might be three kinds. This is, again, he feels like sometimes he's jumping all over the place. And to a degree, this is what the nature of a lecturer is. You do jump around a little bit. Often what we see when we read books these days by philosophers are lectures that they've been doing over a period of time, and then they condense them and they change the order around so it feels more sequential. Whereas what we're getting here is he is jumping around a little bit in his thought and then pulling it back. So here he suggests that there might be three kinds of natures. So what is the nature of moral virtue? What is it in us? He recognizes passions. He recognizes faculties and he recognizes what he calls state of character. Now, he dismisses both passions and faculties because neither involve choice. One is not held to demonstrate virtue or vice because they feel anger. So anger is a passion. You are not judged for being angry. You are judged on the choice you make in the way you act. It is the manner that they act upon that we judge. Aristotle then offers this summation. Virtue then, and I think this is one of the key quotes, virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, so you choose the mean between excess and defect. The mean is relative to us, so it is subjective. This being determined by a rational principle. The way you choose the mean is through rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Practical wisdom, it is something we need to act upon. Okay, so there he goes. This is his scheme. He gives it to his students. How useful is it? Well, finally, he says, here you go. This is what you can use to make judgments about what is right, what is good. If you do that, you will be virtuous. If you are virtuous, you will be happy. You will live well. You will have achieved eudaimonia. You will have achieved happiness and you will be living well. And by the way, not that it's an end, but it will feel pleasant when you do this. Finally, Aristotle admits that the mean, though, is difficult. It is no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle. Therefore, he offers two bits of practical advice. First of all, in all choices, take the lesser of two evils. Again, this implies that we already have some sort of value judgment about which one is worse or better. So again, to go back to courage, at Aristotle's time, we would probably say that most people would say if you had a choice between rashness and cowardice, that cowardice is worse. You might have been rash, but people will go, yes, they were rash trying to take on 20 people by themselves, but at least they tried to take on, they tried to defend the city. Whereas this person was just cowardly. Cowardness is worse than rashness. So they're both vices. They're both not the mean, which is courage. Courage doesn't mean going and trying to fight 20 people if you've got no chance of winning. Courage means making the right choice. It would be courageous to go, I will retreat to fight again. But I'm retreating because I know I can't win this battle, but it will allow me to fight again. I'm not doing it because I'm cowardly. I'm doing it for the right reason. So, first bit of advice, take the lesser of two evils. There's always a lesser, according to Aristotle. So in that case, the lesser would be rashness. Better to be rash and be wrong than to be cowardly and be wrong. Secondly, he notes that when we're presented with a choice, we mostly go for the choice that gives us pleasure. It is more attractive, or the pleasure, again, is a difficult term here, the one that is more attractive to how we would feel. So in that rash versus cowardly, if I'm rash, I'm going to run in to try and take on 20 people, I'm likely to be hurt. If I'm cowardly, I'm going to run away and I'm likely to be hurt physically less. So physically, it will result in less pain. Another way of saying that is, I know this isn't exactly satisfactory, but less pain equals pleasure, so to speak. So Aristotle sort of suggests that in most choices, we tend towards the one that gives us the most pleasure. So to guard against this, to guard against our natural inclination to going towards the most pleasurable one, if you've got a choice and you think, oh, I'm being drawn to this one because it was most likely going to give me most pleasure or the least pain, then identify that in yourself and err the other way. You might go too far the other way. You might go past the mean into rashness, or you might, if you'd gone quite a long way towards cowardness, by erring towards rashness, you might still be within the cowardness part, but you might be closer to the mean. You might go too far, or by practicing this way, you might actually strike the mean, although that is very difficult. So, how useful is it? I suppose we could say it gives us a very practical approach. It gives us some useful advice. It gives us practical advice, which we can put into play in each decision making. It allows for the weaknesses of the theory and gives us ways to deal with that, such as take the lesser of two evils and steer away from the vice that gives pleasure. And that is Book 1, Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So now, go, be good, live well, and achieve happiness.